All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started with what I've got in front of us right here. So as you can see, these are all the pattern pieces for the most part. I'm missing the liner and the main base, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But what you see right here is pretty much every piece of the puzzle that makes up an Air Jordan 1 High in a modern cut. The more you get in your shoemaking journey, the more you'll realize there's more than just one type of Air Jordan 1 High. There's like an Air Jordan 1 High Retro, Air Jordan 1 High Zoom Comfort, Air Jordan 1 High, Off-White. There's plenty of different iterations, and if you're a sneakerhead, you definitely know what I'm talking about. If not, no worries. Basically, what you see in front of you is kind of the pattern pieces that you need to get started. So let's just go over the pieces in general so that way you guys have a good idea as to what I'm talking about when I'm instructing you on how to go through the actual process of making a pair of Air Jordan 1 Highs from scratch. So basically this pattern, and this is not always the case for every single pattern, because you'll learn too that you can get patterns from all sorts of different vendors. And for the most part, I have pretty much the exact same order of operations throughout, but we'll get into that in a bit. Just remember though, for the most part, all of these pieces will be the same depending on the pattern maker that you buy it from. I call them the same pieces, so they are transferable. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with all the upper pieces that include the outer portion of the shoe. So first things first, we're going to get started with these two pieces right here. These are your lateral, so lateral, medial, lower eye stays. An eye stay is a pretty common term. You'll hear that used quite a bit in the footwear realm, but these are going to be your lower eye stays. So lateral, medial. How do you denote the two? If it has a little mountain point right there or tip right there that juts into the actual pattern piece itself, that's how you know it belongs on the inside or medial side of the foot. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll show you, give me 1 second. So when you're looking at a shoe from the top down and you kind of split it in half, this is your lateral side, this is your medial side. So if I ever talk about medial, medial is instep or inside right here. Lateral is outside facing outwards that way. And it's definitely, I would definitely recommend start using that terminology if you already haven't. It's just going to help you in the future when it comes to talking about different parts of the shoe and whatnot. So obviously lateral eye stay, that's that piece right there, just on a Jordan 1 low. We'll keep that there for reference. So these are going to be your lateral and medial eye stays. This is going to be your upper eye stay. That's pretty much what I just call it, but more or less this is your lateral and medial. So this one actually won't change. So if you notice, the reason why you might have two, you're not going to have two of everything, is that if you line them up, they don't quite match up evenly. And that's okay. The reason why that's the case is because when you have a shoe and you're making the pattern, it's going to be a little shorter on this end potentially, or it could be a little longer on this end potentially. It just depends on who made the pattern. There are some patterns where you can use both, kind of like this piece right here. You can use this for both the lateral and the medial, or vice versa, however you want to look at it. But this piece will get used a total of 4 times because you'll have to do it 2 per each shoe. So on a low, that's this piece right here, right? Makes sense? So one there, that's 2 per shoe. That's 4 total after you cut it out. So that's your upper eye stay. Next up, we have your classic swoosh. This one doesn't need a whole lot of explaining. More or less, that's what you're going to be looking at. And this will obviously be used a total of 4 times. Lateral, medial, lateral, lateral, medial again. Next up, another outer piece, we're going to talk about the toe cap. Sometimes referred to as the Vamp. I call this the toe cap. You might hear it be called the Vamp. That's totally acceptable too. What you're seeing here is, again, that's to denote that that's the, what is it? Medial side. So when you bend it like this, if we're looking at these two shoes right here together, this would be your right foot, this would be your left foot. So hopefully that makes sense. You would use this once like this, and then you would have to flip your pattern piece over to get the second piece, the other toe cap, if that makes sense. So one like this facing that way to my right, one like this facing that way to my left. Does that make sense? So that way you have a left and a right foot. Not every pattern piece does that. Obviously, when it comes to the heel tab, you don't necessarily need to flip this because why? Well, it's, you know, It's going to be the same shape no matter which way you put it. So heel tab, these two pieces right here denote where it folds over. We'll go over what registration marks are in the next video. Next up, you've got your, this is what I call the vamp, or you can call this a toe box too. So obviously like these two kind of go together right here, right? So that's how that looks. But you do have a cutout here. So that's going to be a right-footed shoe, left-footed shoe, right-foot shoe, left-foot shoe. Next is the heel cover or heel counter. Some people can call it heel counter as well. I call it heel cover. Ignore all these lines, they won't be on there. But for the most part, this is what it's gonna look like. You've got your registration marks down at the bottom, and then you've got a registration mark up top. This you don't need to flip around. There are some patterns that do have specific ways that you would need to use this, in a sense where you'd go this way and then you flip it this way. But for this pattern, you're just gonna need you're only going to need to flip it, or not flip it at all, excuse me. You'll have that little bump right there. That's to denote the center line. So that hole should match up with the top of that peak right there. That tells you the center point of your actual pattern. Okay, next up, we've got just like the Eyestays, we have the lateral medial quarter panels. How can you tell? Remember, if we go back to talking about what's down at the bottom, that's how you know. So good rule of thumb is that if it has an indication of whether it's medial or lateral, you're probably going to need to trace it and cut it twice. So it would need to be cut and traced this way, cut and traced this way. Same goes for the lateral quarter panel. This way, cut and traced, and this way, cut and traced. So again, quarter panel, this is the lateral quarter panel. This is the medial quarter panel. Next up is the wings. Obviously, if you're a Jordan 1 enthusiast, you know what this is. This is your wings. Some people refer to them as upper Eyestays, but honestly, they're just wings to me. This one, you don't need to flip. You certainly can if you want to, but you definitely don't need to. I would not suggest it. I mean, it's just a kind of a waste of time, but you're gonna cut this and trace it out as well. This will be done twice. Okay, another piece of the outer portion, if you want to count it, is the tongue. So this is going to be the outer portion for the tongue. Pretty straightforward. You don't need to flip this one. This one's pretty standard. And then actually, excuse me, we do have one more piece. This is this piece right here is called the collar. I call it the collar, at least. This is the top of the shoe that you're looking at. You don't need to flip this one. You'll be cutting this and tracing this twice. So let's go over again all the outer pieces that you're going to be cutting out and naming them. We started off with the lower medial and lateral eyestays. This is the medial eyestay because of the notch. This is the lateral eyestay because it's flat down at the bottom. You'll be cutting these out a total of 2 times, cutting and tracing, excuse me, per pattern piece. So once like this, once like this. Same goes for this one. Once like this, once like that. Lower Eyestays. Next up, upper Eyestays. Cutting this out a total of 4 times, twice like this, twice like that. So again, cut and trace twice like this, cut and trace twice like that. Swoosh, cut out 4 times, twice like this, twice like this. Pretty straightforward. Toe cap, once like this, once like this. Okay? So traced and cut once like this, traced and cut once like this. Same exact rules apply for the vamp or the toe box. Heel tab, 2 times total. Lateral and medial quarter panels, once like this, traced and cut, once like this, traced and cut. Wings, cut out a total of 2 times and traced like this. Heel cover, traced and cut twice like this. Collar, traced and cut twice like this. And tongue, traced and cut 2 times like this. All right, so those are going to be all your upper pieces. I'm going to get them out of the way so we can start focusing on the internal bits of the shoe because those are just as important. Okay, so next up we are going to talk about linings. So what you have in front of us are a mix of internal pieces as well as linings for an Air Jordan 1 High. So to get things started, let's look at the linings. So the first lining we have of the pattern pieces is the Vamp Lining. So the Vamp Lining is pretty straightforward. This is going to be the part that actually touches your foot on the inside of the shoe. You obviously can't see it, but it would hide somewhere in this area right here. You'll notice that it does have a mark right here, a notch right here. That notch is to denote medial and lateral. So this would be a left foot, this would be a right foot, depending on how you trace this. So this you would need to trace out twice. A little bit more theory that comes into this too when we get along to that realm, but we'll talk about it when we get to that point. Just note that that's a very important piece to remember. You need at least two of these, one this way and one this way. Okay, next up is the tongue lining. This is a very straightforward piece. These are just registration marks, and again, I'll go over that in a little bit, but this is going to be your tongue lining. So this is what's going to fall right here. The other part of your liner is the main base, or what I call the main base liner. So this is a portion that is going to be sewn to the upper pieces that we just went over in the previous video, and it will get flipped or stitched and flipped over to where you will actually be able to touch this portion with your foot. So this will be this part right here. It goes to about right there on that stitch or on that seam. Note that it does have two pieces right here. Those are going to line up with your actual outer pieces that we just went over, but this does have a medial and a lateral side. So this would be a left foot, and then this would be a right foot. It also has a registration mark for the foam pieces that we're just about to go over. Your liner pattern pieces are going to be maybe a little bit bigger of an outline compared to the rest of your other pieces, and that's just to make sure that you have enough allowance so that when you are sewing and cutting, you're not cutting into the actual liner itself. Moving on, this is just a main base guide. So you don't have to use this, and I would recommend you don't. It builds up a little bit more bulk. This may or may not be included in your pattern piece, depending on if you got it from us yet or not. But for the most part, this pattern piece right here is optional. So again, this is an optional pattern piece. This is more or less just to help guide everything all together. So that way you have a straight line down the middle, and that way you're not kind of shifting to one side or the other on the upper. It'll make more sense once we get into it. You can definitely start out with it if you want to, but you definitely don't have to. Okay, so moving on to what we've got here. So let's talk about foam. So for foams, we've got three foam pieces. We've got tongue foam, we've got collar foam 1 and collar foam 2. That's what I call those. So you'll notice collar foam 2 is a little bit smaller than collar foam 1. That's on purpose. It's mainly because, and it depends on preference. So this is the most important part of this aspect when it comes to foams. It all comes down to what you prefer. If you like having a really thick collar area where you like a lot of padding and you like that plushness, I would suggest using both of these. If you don't necessarily like using a lot of thickness and you want a more streamlined, or how do I put it, more like an athletic fit, I guess is a good way to say it, I would recommend you going with just one pattern piece, and preferably the big one. You don't really need the small one if you don't want it, but it's up to you. Again, that's preference. We'll go over foam thickness too once we get to this portion, but for the most part, that's kind of the background here when it comes to choosing your foams. Same goes for this one too. So that's going to be your foams. Lastly, we have internal bits, and this is a very important part. So without these, you're not going to have a very sturdy shoe. This portion right here is called a toe puff. Now, this toe puff is denoted, obviously, by a medial side and a lateral side. So you are going to have to flip this one over twice and trace and cut. But this would be a left foot, this would be a right foot. Toe puff is basically the portion that hides from here forward all the way up to here. And what it does is when you do this to a retail shoe, it pops back into place. It'll slowly pop back into place on this one, but more or less, there you go. So yeah, more or less it will pop back into place, or it keeps its shape. There you go, just like that. So essentially that's what it's supposed to be doing, because leather on its own can't necessarily always do that. Very important piece to have in terms of structural integrity. You definitely want this, because if you don't have it, your toe box could cave in on you, and then your leather could actually deteriorate a lot faster over time. Moving forward, we've got another set of internal pieces. This piece right here is called a filler piece. This will come in handy more so when we get to the point of filling it in, and I'll show you. It's a little hard to explain, but literally all it does is it just fills in a gap so that there's not a lack of material or a negative space inside of the shoe somewhere. But it goes right about here on a retail pair, and it sits in there because it needs to hold up this piece. Now this is a very important piece. This is the heel counter. So heel filler, heel counter. Heel filler sits underneath this and kind of bumps this guy up and gives it a little bit more of a presence, and is super helpful. This one you don't need to trace and cut in different directions. You can just do it once, but it needs to be cut twice. So again, here is the heel counter. This piece is usually internalized on a pair of Nikes from that era, like 1985. You'll see in a lot more recent shoes, heel counters might be more apparent. You can actually see them on the outsides a little bit better, but for most Nikes, they're going to be internalized. So if you hear that knocking, that's a heel counter. That stabilizes the ankle in place to where you don't fall over or left or right. Super important to have. We'll go over a little bit more about this once we get to that point. But yes, you will need to trace and cut this out twice.